let's have a look at our preference shares. Now, first, we are going to talk about important characteristics of preference shares. Now, if you look at the right side, we have a parent and we have our subsidiary, and the subsidiary has authorized and issued ordinary shares as well as preference shares. Now, I've just indicated shareholders, but it's shares. Remember, authorized is that they indicate in the memorandum of incorporation they may issue, for example, 1,000 ordinary shares and 1,000 preference shares, but then they only issue portion of that. Therefore, there will always then be a remaining portion until they issue all of the authorized shares in terms of the memorandum of incorporation. Okay, now it is important that you understand the characteristics of preference shares. Now, the first bullet point, cumulative. What does this mean? When dividends are declared, our ordinary shareholders may not receive dividends until all of the preference dividends are declared. Therefore, they will first have to declare preference dividends, and then only may our ordinary shareholders receive a dividend. Versus non-cumulative, our preference shareholders are not entitled to dividends in arrears. Now, if you look at a timeline, as always, let's say, for example, at the end of year 1 and year 2. At the end of year 1, they did not declare any preference shareholders dividends, right? The preference shareholders did not receive a dividend. May we declare dividends to our ordinary shareholders at the end of year 2 if our preference shares are cumulative? No. We will first have to declare to our preference shareholders relating to year 1 profits, and then to our preference shareholders relating to year 2 profits, and then only in year 2 may our ordinary shareholders receive a dividend. Therefore, we will first have to declare the dividends to our cumulative preference shareholders before our ordinary shareholders will be able to receive a dividend. Let's move on to bullet point 2, participating versus non-participating preference shares. Participating will be fixed dividends plus remaining share of distribution of profits. Now, for example, if you think about the agreement, memorandum of incorporation, it can indicate that your preference shareholders will receive, for example, fixed 15,000 each year, plus remaining share of distributable profits agreed. Okay, versus non-participating, share of profit is restricted to fixed percentage of dividends. They will only receive a fixed percentage of dividends. Then redeemable versus non-redeemable. When we look at redeemable, this will be to compensate our preference shareholders through profits or proceeds of issue of new shares. Versus non-redeemable, they will not be compensated through profits or issue of new shares, right? Okay, so normally our preference shareholders will not carry a vote except where the preference dividend is in arrears and remains unpaid, except if the dividends are outstanding to our preference shareholders, then it may carry a vote. Okay, then our focus is only on the equity instruments, preference shares, when we look at our consolidation process, and then financial liability, preference shares. Look at this. Financial liabilities, preference shares, are not consolidated. This we normally treat as our financial instruments, IAS 32, IFRS 7, and IFRS 9. Now, let's have a look at the preference share in terms of our NCI measurement. If the preference shareholders are not entitled on liquidation to a proportionate share of the acquiree's net assets and are only entitled to receive repayment of the nominal value of the preference shares. Then we measure them at acquisition date fair value. Okay, now what does this mean? If, for example, our parent has preference shares in the subsidiary, but should the subsidiary be liquidated, our parent will not receive a portion of the net asset value. Our parent will only be entitled to repayment of the nominal value of the preference shares. Then our NCI should be measured at fair value at acquisition date, compared to when our preference shareholders are entitled to, well, they will receive a portion of the net asset value. Then they can either recognize the NCI at fair value at acquisition date or based on proportionate share. Right, now consolidation, pay attention to the rights attached to your preference shares. It's important that you look at the rights, understand the characteristics. Allocate your total owner's equity between your different classes of capital in accordance with the rights. Okay. Now, my recommendation, if there is a question where you have preference shareholders, do an analysis of owner's equity for the ordinary shares and a separate AOE for your preference shares. Therefore, you will have two. You will have an analysis of owner's equity for your ordinary shares and for your preference shares. Then it is extremely important in the analysis of owner's equity of your ordinary shares, you will have to allocate the dividends which should be paid to your preference shareholders. Look at this. In the AOE, the portion attributable to the preference shareholders must be allocated first. Then the remaining balance can be attributable to the ordinary shareholders. And then in your analysis of owner's equity of your preference shareholders, you will identify, we allocate the dividends, and then remember the dividends, if it's declared, we take this out again.